So my name is Manuel Talavera. I'm a training and development specialist with the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, and this webinar is on supporting students transition to college. Um, Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items. So you may have already heard that session is being recorded. So we record our sessions and upload them to our website, um, which is linked here. If you are having trouble hearing me, you can use the audio option through your computer. If you hover your mouse over the downward button and click audio options, it'll give you the option to call in. We also are using Q&A as well. Also enabled the chat, so if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A. This webinar concludes our um, sort of tour that we have, where we do our PD webinars as well as other professional development opportunities that we have in person throughout the state. So this is where we're kind of concluding it. We are also offering continuing education as well as professional development hours. So please stay tuned at the end of this webinar where we'll have some more information about how to access your continuing education or your PD hours. So for those who don't know about ISAC, so we're the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. So we're a state agency, the largest one-stop resource for financial aid information in this state. And our mission is to provide Illinois students with information and assistance to help make education beyond high school more accessible and affordable. We do this by administering grants and scholarships, such as the Monetary Award Program, the MTI Scholarship, and really other grants and scholarships throughout the state. In our division of college access systems, we provide professional development opportunities to college access professionals throughout the state, whether it's in person, webinars, and topics just like the ones that we're covering today, also in financial aid and the FAFSA, student loan forgiveness, you name it. So what are some of the things that we're going to be covering today? We're going to talk about summer melt. We'll also define what is verification melt, also ways to prevent them in terms of your role with students. So if you are in a capacity where you work with students over the summer, I think this webinar will provide great information for you. Or if you're in a position where you can pass this information along to other professionals in your building, in your school or organization, you can pass along the information to them. They are the ones that work with those during that summer. But in particularly, right, we only have a limited amount of time to work with our students before they graduate and leave our building forever, right? Unless they come back as alumni. But in terms of the context of post-secondary preparation, right, we only have a few amount of weeks left, right? And students can already be checking out, waiting for the summer, right? Getting themselves ready to enroll. But what we want to do is prevent that melt from happening. So we'll talk about different resources and prevention strategies to ensuring that your students, they make a successful transition from high school to college and onwards. So we'll talk about first discussing what is summer melt. So I've always thought of summer melt in the context setting of whether you're in elementary school, high school, or all the information that you've gained throughout the year, thinking ourselves as climbing that sort of slide, right? So climbing a ladder, getting up to the slide, right? We get to the top, that's towards the end of summer, or to the beginning of summer. And then if we don't have opportunities to continue to challenge ourselves to whether it's reading or some kind of assignments or some kind of summer camps that keeps us engaged, we can lose a lot of that information very quickly, right? And so a lot of times the students get re-enrolled back into school for that following year, and this goes through even in college as well, often have to retrack and regroup, relearn things, whether students in college, while the professors may not be reteaching things, students may have to work twice as hard for the first couple of weeks to catch up. So essentially, summer melt are, in this context, for post-secondary preparation and access. So with students who have applied, they've been accepted to college, but they don't end up enrolling, right, in that specific college or any post-secondary institution. And in some cases, those students may have already made a deposit and have taken other steps to enroll in that institution. It could be for a wide list of reasons. Life happens, other deposits that come up, or just other things the student who now no longer has that support system that they had while they were in school, right? So it's ensuring that everything is in place so that when they do graduate, leave your building, they have all the tools and resources they need to get themselves through the summer and into that college seat in whatever campus they're interested in enrolling into. So, what are some of the causes? Right. So, summer melt, as mentioned, occurs when the student are expected to complete a certain list of tasks, and we know that I'm going to get a little ahead of myself, but such as completing housing deposits, tuition deposits, um, core requisite exams. I can't find the right word for it at the top of my head, but they're expected to complete a list of prior tasks before completing and enrolling into college, rather not completing, but enrolling into college. Now, what can happen is you may have students who are just unfamiliar with the support services available, especially over the summer. They assume that because it's summer, no one is available, right? That could be further from the truth. You could have students who are first in their family to go to college, so their family has little to no experience with the college going process, or it's been so long that the parents have gone to college that the process is completely different. Um, Also, technology access. We've saw this during the pandemic that exacerbated a lot of the technological disadvantages that a lot of members from inner city and rural communities face, as well as the complexity of completing a process, whether it's submitting a financial aid application. We saw that with the start of the 24-25 FAFSA, with FAFSA simplification and all the changes that came with it and the challenges that came with that. But even continuing in the 25-26 year. Also submitting verification documents. So students who have been selected for verification may be asked to submit additional documentation or supporting documentation. Or if you have a student who is um, going through professional judgment, meaning they have a situation that they weren't able to disclose in the FAFSA because the FAFSA doesn't provide opportunities for you to enter situations that are happening. But you can have a student, so for example, fill out the FAFSA, okay, no issues, but then one parent lost a job, right? So in that case, they need to reach out to the financial aid office to complete the professional judgment process. So then of it itself creates additional barriers for students, as well as submitting housing applications and other types of applications related to their stay at the institution. And with each institution having their own processes in place, we know that we can provide some blanket information, but the technical information specific to institutions can vary. So I often, at this point, I don't like to address too much because it's not like in the very early stages when students are submitting a FAFSA, they still don't know what institution they're enrolling in, so they may have to go through the same process at different institutions. But at this point, in verification, which I'll get to in a little bit, and summer melt, they are enrolling in that one specific institution, so they won't have to worry about going through that process at other schools, right? Because they've already intended to enroll in that institution. Whether they enroll in it or not is a different story, but this is what I'm kind of referring to in terms of the same process in this specific context. So, what are some of the impacts of summer melt? So, I got a lot of this data from the National College Attainment Network, NCAN. And this report looked at, which was published earlier this year, looked at the fall enrollment class of 2024. But what they saw it was an estimate of anywhere from 10 to 40% of high school students that intend to enroll in college don't actually do so. And that range is really high. And what that's impacts that more in that range will depend on whether the student is low income, so that percentage increases. Whether the student is African American or Latino, so that will increase that percentage. And if they're a first generation student, will also increase that percentage. And if they're a mixed multitude of those three different dimensions, then that will continue to further exacerbate that rate. But what we also saw in this report was that post-secondary enrollment in the fall of 2024 is about 0.04 or zero point 0.4, I should say, higher than pre-COVID levels. So we've sort of have gone from that dip back up. However, total enrollment we know is up from compared to last year, almost 5%, 4.5 to be exact. But that total number of enrollment still remains below 2019 levels. And for those who have attended or other professional development opportunities, like one that we did earlier in the year that looked into enrollment trends, K through 12 enrollment trends in Illinois. Specifically, we know that we are enrolling less and less students in our public school systems, which means less and less students enrolling in high school, which would ultimately mean less and less students enrolling in post-secondary enrollment after they graduate from high school. But that's a topic for a different conversation. But we did see enrollment in community colleges increase by 5.9% in the fall of 2024. And that includes students who are in dual enrollment, dual credit type of courses. So what are ways that students can prepare? And certainly there are things that you can do right now to ensure that your students are prepared by following a good old checklist, ensuring that some institutions have their own specific checklist. So I would first go and see, hey, what institution are you interested in enrolling in? Is there a checklist? Certainly you can have your own generic version for students, but I often will tell students that always double check with your school to see if there's something missing, because there could be something additional that's required that you may not have caught because it's very specific to that institution. So first thing I tell students is navigate the portal, student portal. And this is important because that's where most, if not all, the communication from a school happens to the student until their email is set up, or if there's additional alerts and things of that nature. That is where they will send that information to students. So it's really important that they have an account set up with the school, have the password saved so they can log in without any issues and communicate accordingly, right? If they've already received their financial aid offer, then they should have already reviewed it and within the student portal system, accept or decline any scholarships, grants, or student loans, or really anything that they want to accept or decline on there. And that's an important step. Otherwise, you will not receive financial aid if that's not completed. If there are any pending processes, like submitting housing applications, tuition deposits, check to see if there are any waivers attached with them. And even if there are, it doesn't guarantee that the institution will accept them, but at least it provides a pathway for students to go through that process in the event that the institution will accept them. Now, a lot of institutions require freshmen and sometimes up to sophomores to live on campus. So you may have to submit a waiver. And this is where it's really important to follow through with deadlines, because once you pass that deadline, the institution will assume that you're going to live on campus, or maybe assume that you are not going to live on campus, depending on how that and all that is worded. So you either may be out of housing at the school, or maybe required to now live on campus, or pay for those services, even though you won't be using them. So it's really important that you submit and go through those processes as according. Now, students may also be required to attend orientation. So find out when is orientation, whether there are multiple orientations, like maybe there are ones specific for students who are first in their family. Maybe there are ones for students who are of a particular racial background or a different demographic. So it's important that students are keeping up with that information. It's also required so that students are familiarized with the resources and staff on campus that are there to support them. Lastly, probably most important is to determine what is going to be the cost of attendance, right? What is going to be the out-of-pocket expense after all financial aid has been applied. Looking at the end of the day, are there any additional expenses not accounted for? Maybe health insurance costs, parking permits, clothes to go to school, food. So you want to make sure all of those processes have been in place. Checklists is looking more and more completed, um, so that no small or large steps are left unattended. Some other additional things the students should go through, they should complete the verification process if they've been selected. And this part is important because if they have been selected for verification, think about verification as going through airport security. So while you don't have to fly in the plane, you don't have to receive financial aid in similar context. So if you don't complete verification, much like if you don't go to the airport security, you're not going to fly in the plane. You don't complete verification, you're not going to receive financial aid, even if the FAFSA determined you were eligible to receive MAP and Pell and other grants and scholarships. So verification is really important. And the process is somewhat consistent across institutions, but the documentation that's accepted is what varies. Also, institutions will have different deadlines, and so that's the important piece is paying closer attention. So if you have a student in the very early stages of verification, meaning they've submitted the FAFSA, they haven't committed themselves to an institution quite yet, so they're going to be going through that process across different institutions. They also now going back to our student who's graduating, you want to make sure they get their final transcript, send that out to the college. If they've taken any AP tests, that they're sending them over to the institutions. Like it's important because then if they get college credits, they can apply those already. And this was the word that I was kind of tongue twisted. Prerequisite. I call it prerequisite test, but it's the placement test. And this ensures what grade level the student will start their college courses at, particularly English and math. So we know that any course level that's over 100 level will count towards a college credit and graduation. Anything below will only count for a grade that's used to progress the student upwards towards the college credit level, but will not count towards graduation. It's not a credit bearing class. What could that mean for the student? If you take a traditional student attending full time at 15 credit hours, that's 5 classes times 3, assuming that the course is all over 3 credit hours, that will ensure that the student graduates in 4 years. Now, you may have a situation where if they had to take Math 98 and Math 99, we know they're going to be 6 credit hours below. So that means that in 2 semesters, they need to take an additional course, right, to make it 6 classes instead of 5. Or they may have to stay at a summer course to ensure that they're taking, to avoid having to take 6 courses if they were planning to be over the summer. And keep in mind, oftentimes summer courses are in shorter schedules. Oftentimes they are much more quicker, much more advanced in that sense. So I tell students to just be aware that the pace is different. However, it is just one course to worry about versus 4 or 5 courses, or maybe less. We have talked a little bit about the immunizations as well as health insurance. So you're required to have health insurance. So if you already have one through your parents, students are able to stay on their parents' insurance until their age of 25. So if they have them, if they have insurance, they need to provide documentation that they have it. Otherwise, they're going to see a very large expense in their student account, which at least when I was enrolled at UIS 10 years ago, uh, some maybe even longer than that, but it hurts to say 10. Technically, that's a decade. But anyway, it was $440 a semester. So I'm sure that with inflation, it is much more expensive now. But because I had insurance, I got it waived. And so it's really important that students who already have insurance can get that waived. But if they need it, it's there and available for them. And last, probably the more, well, I have 2 things left. But the more important one is to register for classes. Well, otherwise, if you go through all these processes to register for classes, you're going to be left with the very end of the barrel. course selection, which can be very problematic. We'll talk about that. But you want to arrange transportation to and from the school. Now, if you're in the inner city in Chicago, we know that you have access to CTA. Oftentimes, institutions will provide the student with a sort of bus or a train pass. They called it the U Pass when I was in college. Could be different now with their Venture Pass, but keep in mind this allows them to use unlimited amount of rides to and from school. There is a cost associated with it. It's one of those things where the more you use it, the more cost effective it becomes. But if you're going to an area where public transportation and that nature isn't as available, it's helpful to just familiarize yourself with what is the transportation like at the school. I know that when I visited Champaign-Urbana, U of I has a very robust busing system that will take students to and from different buildings across campus, take them throughout different places at the university, and they may also offer emergency type transportation. I know at UIS they were experimenting a while of busing students a certain time of day, certain days of the week to a local Walmart to ensure that they had time and transportation to buy groceries that they needed. And lastly, when it comes to register for classes, so when I mentioned you want to register early, you don't want to take your time with registering for classes. What can happen is you need to take specific courses, and sometimes they're only offered, oh hack, sometimes they're only offered in certain times of the year. So if you missed the course schedule for the fall, you may not be able to take that during the spring. So you have to wait until the next fall to take that course, which could also hamper other plans. So the best way to avoid this is setting up a meeting with your academic advisor to ensure that everything that you're doing is counted towards your major and minor so that you're not wasting anyone's time. Or if you're a student, more importantly, the student's time. Or if you're in a community college, then now you have to ensure, okay, these courses I need to take to graduate, but I also want them to transfer to this institution. Now, a lot of institutions have 2+2 programs or just partnerships in general, where you have guaranteed admissions or you'll be able to receive additional scholarships and things like that because you took those certain courses and they transferred over to that new institution. Then we'll talk a little bit about verification mount. So verification mount, and this is also definitions from NCAN, is failing to complete the verification process, which could derail a student from receiving a Pell Grant, another federal financial aid. And if you're a student in Illinois, that also includes the MAP grant as well, which if we included both values not represented on here, that's over $15,000 of free money, up to $15,000 of free money that a student will not receive because they didn't complete the verification process. So verification process is in and of itself under summer melt, but because this is such a big issue that occurs every year, I felt the need to sort of address it separately. We already talked about the deadlines that needed to submit verification documents, but we know that low-income students are disproportionately selected for verification, in part because those are the students who are using Pell Grant, and because of which they are an increased risk of verification now because they're more than likely to be selected for verification. So what are some of those causes? One of them can be difficulty obtaining the requested documentation. They are unfamiliar with the process, or maybe they're just intimidated by it. I remember when I was selected for verification, I got that email from the school, and it looked something much more serious than what it was. I told my parents he thought that I told my dad particularly, and he thought that we were going to get audited by the IRS, and he was just super nervous and was frustrated that I had made a mistake on the FAFSA, which just wasn't the case. Which also, for other things, especially in professional judgment, there could be issues about providing requested documentation. So if you have a student who maybe lost a parent, and now they have to prove to the institution that they lost their parent, they need a death certificate. So it's something that the student is already grieving, going through that grieving process, and now has to provide additional documentation for the institution. And that's really important because then the institution needs to be able to document that whatever situation the student is facing, they have supporting documentation for that. It is not because they want to single out that student. and make them face additional barriers. It's because institutions, financial aid offices in general, they get audited by the Department of Education and by ISAC. So they need to ensure that they are awarding financial aid to students who need it and go through the process according to rules and regulations of law. Students sometimes may be unaware that they've been selected for verification. While I don't have a sample FAFSA submission summary on this presentation, but it indicates when a student submits their FAFSA, they've been selected for verification. The FAFSA, the Department of Education also emails the students that they've been selected for verification. And if that happens, then the school will also email the student that they've been selected for verification, that they need to submit supporting documentation. So those processes are really important to ensure that the student does not fall through the cracks. What can also happen is the student just doesn't know about the process. So what can help in decrease the level of fear when it comes to verification is just talk about what that process is like, that institutions use this process, Department of Education uses this process to ensure that only eligible students are selected or only eligible students receive federal student aid. It is not to single out the student. Maybe the FAFSA did catch a mistake or inconsistency, and that's why the student is selected for verification. But really, the rates these days are much lower. It's less than 10%. It used to be as high as 25% back before the pandemic. But now with the learning model that Department of Education is using, as well as a direct data exchange, the likelihood of verification amount is decreasing over time, but it's still important enough that I feel like we need to address. So what are some of the impacts of verification melts? And so again, these are some data that's from 2021. The National College Attainment Network, talk about NCAN, estimates that 7.2% of students experience verification melt. And when it comes to being selected for verification, that significantly reduces a student's immediate enrollment by almost 4%. And if a student is an underrepresented student, then that number is closer to 6%. And then for students who submit a FAFSA and they're selected for verification, they saw a decrease in the likelihood of immediate enrollment. So verification does provide a big obstacle for many students. Keep in mind that when I talked about the data being from 2021, we haven't had new data in part because for the last three FAFSA cycling, not including this year, a little bit of last year, most of these items have been suspended for verification in part because of the pandemic and allowing students and institutions to kind of recover from all of that. So institutions weren't really verifying students unless it was an issue for identity theft and things like that, then they were verifying that student. Excuse me. So this chart is from NCAN, and I wanted to highlight what they call the leaky FAFSA pipeline. And this kind of talked about a number of students who are from low-income backgrounds, they're seniors in high school, they're going to submit a FAFSA, right? So of the 1.9 million high school seniors, only 1.1 million will submit a FAFSA, right? So more than 40% are not submitting a FAFSA. So just like that, 40% already out of the equation. Now, what's important about filling out a FAFSA is that it significantly increases the odds that the student is going to go to college. So that's why that is really important. And so we have 44% are selected for verification of that number. And it's from 2022, of which 37% of those selected for verification experience that melt. So again, out of that 1.9 million, only 702,000 go to college, right? End up using that financial aid. So it's a big deal. So what are some verification action items? So using the direct data exchange, submitting tax transcript, submitting the change of address form, copies of your W-2 and other records of income. And just as a quick refresher, that verification is greatly reduced moving forward in part because of the direct data exchange and all that information being pulled directly, or financial information, I should say, being pulled directly from the IRS. So now I want to talk about ways to prevent summer and verification notes. So you want to make sure students are opening and reading emails. Oftentimes they're not communicating through mail anymore, but some institutions may still. And you want to make sure students are responding appropriately. that they are not waiting too long to apply, that they are aware of those deadlines, and to continue to make and meet those deadlines. They also may need to check different folders to ensure that they are getting the information that they need. Now, when it comes to setting up a preparation checklist, now you can certainly do generic ones for your students, but it's also important for students first to check to see which institution they are enrolling in, whether they have their own checklist. But then when they go ahead and create their own, they can also include other ones from institutions. Or you can also, when creating one, put in like if applicable. So that applies for the student if they're enrolling in an institution, they ask for it. So you can certainly be more encompassing of the different checklists, different items within the checklist, and then putting in if applicable, if relevant. We want to make sure students are starting to shop, starting to gather their list, and getting themselves ready to go. To continue with that mindset that yes, I'm going, yes, I'm college material, yes, I will be there on day one. You want to submit your verification and additional documentation on time. Do not wait until the end of summer. Take your time to gather that information, ask questions, ensure that the student is not just left with the time to figure everything out on their own. You also want to make sure they're submitting those tuition and housing deposits. And if there are any confusion about any sort of documentation, that's why it's helpful that when you're telling students about what to expect, especially over the summer, that these things pop up and ways that they can, at that point start contacting, getting more comfortable, reaching out to the school and asking those questions. Because sometimes mail gets lost or email doesn't get sent or maybe it goes to spam or for whatever reason the student didn't get it. That way they're at least figuring out like, hey, I didn't receive any communication. Have you sent anything yet? So that the student doesn't miss anything. It's also important that the student visit the college during the summer, and this really helps to instill a connection to campus. And the connection is the more the student feels connected to the campus, the less likely they are to drop out or not enroll because then they start meeting people, they start feeling connected and develop a more sense of belonging at that institution. So really visiting early stages, I think, is really important. So try at your school at least setting up bus transportation or virtual visits, things where students can start feeling connected with that school. And you also want to encourage your students to ask questions, to stay informed, whether it's Office of Admissions, Student Services, the Financial Aid Office. It's helpful for students to develop advocacy skills so that they have the ability to go through that process and see what information is needed for them so they can enroll accordingly and not miss anything. I do want to talk a little bit about resources for preventing a summer verification as well. So first we have the ISAC College Q&A. So there's a feature for students. We have service here is available here in Spanish as well, where students can use this over the summer. They can set up a meeting with an ISAC core member in their area that can help walk them through that process that's still remaining, right? That's something to help them avoid summer melt to ensure that they transition to college, right? You can go to NCAN's Summer Melt resource page. So they have a lot of great strategies and resources for students to check different checklists and things like that, where they can use to help them avoid summer melt. We also have a ISAC senior checklist. So while most of this information pertains to like throughout the calendar year, but at least while they're there at our website, they could then search other resources on ISAC, like connecting with an ISAC core member if they needed to ask anyone for questions. We also have a PACE student checklist, which is very similar to the one that we have on our website about ISAC's resources, but this one specifically is on the post-secondary and career expectations framework, which pertains to the items on that framework. So the school, high school, you may have your own version of this checklist, which certainly one that you can create if you already have a framework, but there's something that's there that's available for you. Also, check the college's website. We talked about this before. See what type of checklist is on their website. This one, for example, DePaul, they have one that's specifically tailored to that school, obviously, because they'll have what their student portal is named, or maybe they use something else. Maybe the student has to set up their account themselves. This piece is really, really important for students. As well as College Board. So this is called Big Future. They have a huge checklist of different steps that students should do over the summer before they go to college, such as reviewing financial aid offers, making a decision, how to make a decision, register and attend orientation, ways that they can pay their tuition bill, and how they can pay for remaining balances, how they can set up a payment plan, those types of things. And then if you're working with students and you're in a FAFSA completion workshop and you've seen that they cannot use the direct data exchange for a wide list of reasons, then you know that the chances of them being verified for income information is going to increase substantially. So a great way to prepare for that is to have them request an IRS tax transcript. So these are free and are not similar to requesting a tax return, a copy of their tax return, because if someone goes to the IRS and requests a copy of their tax return, well, that costs $50, and that will give them a full copy of their tax returns. Right? What a tax transcript is, and if you haven't requested one, I recommend everyone here to request one to see what that process is like. To go online, they can immediately receive a tax transcript they can then use for verification when they get selected for it. Because chances are, if they're manually entering income information, they're going to get verified. Because how else will the school know that that information is really what that information is, right? And something getting pulled directly from the IRS, already that's the best kind of information you can provide because it's coming from the IRS directly. We also have our first generation scholars network. So this is particularly for students who are first in family root college. So we have additional resources for them that are tailored to students, again, who are first gen. And they can get connected to different resources on campus, especially those that offer first generation programs. And we're also here to help. So as a professional, we have this resource available. It's called ISAC Connection. So this number is particularly set up just for professionals. So you can text us at 847-250-2384. And so we have real people that will answer your questions if you have any regarding some amount or really anything in terms of the financial aid process. And lastly, so as I mentioned, we are offering continuing education and professional development hours. So if you need if you need any of these or you just like to provide us feedback, my colleague Olivia, thank you. She gave you the link if you want the link to complete it later, but you can also with your phone scan the QR code here and complete the survey. It takes just a couple of minutes. Just know that if you are requesting PD hours, we need you to include your EIN, and we will get this information sent out to you the next couple of days after the closing date of just Thursday, May 8th. I'll leave this here for a couple more seconds for those to scan. Okay. And from here, does anyone have any questions or comments? I want to talk a little bit about your experience transitioning from high school to summer. I think oftentimes that helps with students. I just tell students right away that the process is what it is to just prepare themselves for it. Just like if they were vacationing somewhere or going on a trip, what are the things that they need to carry with them to just feel more prepared? Otherwise, here is our contact information. You can reach us at isaac.outreachtraining@illinois.gov. And we also encourage you all to sign up for e-messaging if you're not already signed up. So with that, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and stop.